Sarah Martinez stepped off the bus and looked up at the tall building in front of her. The Berkshire Conservatory stood like a palace made of red brick and white stone. Big windows reflected the morning sun. Students walked up and down the wide steps carrying fancy instrument cases and thick music books. Sarah held her old canvas bag tighter. Inside was her worn sheet music and a small water bottle. She had packed a sandwich for lunch because she could not afford to buy food at the school cafeteria. Her shoes were clean but old. Her dress was simple and dark blue. She had bought it at a thrift store last month for this special day. The annual student showcase was the biggest event at the conservatory. Students from all over the country came to perform. Some hoped to win scholarships. Others wanted to impress teachers and make connections. For Sarah, this day meant everything. It was her chance to prove she belonged here. She walked up the steps, slowly. Other students moved past her with confidence. They talked about their private teachers and summer music camps. They mentioned competitions they had won and famous musicians they had met. Sarah listened but said nothing. She felt like an outsider looking through a window. The main hall was huge. The ceiling was very high with painted decorations. Crystal lights hung down like frozen waterfalls. Red velvet chairs were arranged in perfect rows, facing a black grand piano that gleamed under the stage lights. Sarah had never seen such a beautiful piano before. She found a seat in the back row. From here she could watch everything without drawing attention to herself. Students filled the seats around her. Most wore expensive clothes and carried leather bags with gold buckles. Their parents sat in the front rows wearing suits and jewelry that caught the light. Sarah thought about her own parents. Her father worked at a factory. Her mother cleaned offices at night. They could not take time off work to come today, but they had saved money for months to buy her the bus ticket to get here. They believed in her dream even when she doubted herself. A girl with perfect blonde hair sat down nearby. She was talking on an expensive phone about her performance. She mentioned studying with a famous teacher in New York. She complained that the piano on stage was not the same brand she was used to playing. Sarah looked at her own hands. They were clean but showed small scars from her part-time job washing dishes at a restaurant. The conservatory had given Sarah a scholarship to study music therapy. She worked with elderly people at a nursing home. Every day after her regular classes, she went there to play piano for the residents. She played songs from their youth. She watched their faces light up when they remembered dancing to those tunes. She saw tears in their eyes when she played their wedding songs. That was how she learned to play piano, not from expensive lessons or famous teachers. She learned by watching the faces of old people who had lived full lives. She learned by feeling their emotions and trying to match them with music. Every note she played had meaning. Every song told a story. But here at the conservatory, she wondered if that was enough. The other students talked about technical skills she had never heard of. They used words like fortissimo and allegro as if everyone should know what they meant. Sarah played by feeling. She played what sounded right to her ears and felt right in her heart. She opened her bag and looked at her sheet music. The pages were yellow and soft from being handled so many times. Some corners were torn. She had written notes in pencil along the edges. These were not the clean, perfect copies that other students had, but every mark on these pages meant something too. A boy sitting 2 rows ahead turned around and looked at her. He whispered something to his friend and they both laughed quietly. Sarah felt her cheeks get warm. She put her sheet music back in her bag and tried to make herself smaller in her seat. The showcase was about to begin. A woman in a black dress walked onto the stage. She was the director of the conservatory. She spoke about excellence and tradition. She talked about the high standards expected from every student. Sarah listened to every word and felt the weight of them on her shoulders. The first student walked onto the stage. He was tall and confident. He wore a black suit that looked expensive. He sat at the piano and played a piece by Chopin. His fingers moved fast across the keys. The notes were clear and precise. When he finished, everyone clapped loudly. His parents in the front row beamed with pride. More students performed. Each one seemed more skilled than the last. A girl played violin with perfect technique. A boy sang in a voice that filled the entire hall. Sarah watched and listened. She felt smaller with each performance. These students had trained for years with the best teachers. They had grown up surrounded by classical music. They belonged here in a way that she did not. But then she remembered Mrs. Chen at the nursing home. Mrs. Chen had dementia and rarely spoke anymore. But when Sarah played Moon River, Mrs. Chen would sing along softly. Her face would clear, and for a few minutes, she was herself again. Sarah remembered Mr. Johnson, who cried every time she played In the Mood, because it reminded him of dancing with his wife who had died 5 years ago. Those moments were real. They mattered. Music was not just about perfect technique or impressive performances. It was about touching hearts and healing souls. Sarah knew this in a way that maybe some of these students did not yet understand. She straightened up in her seat. She was here for a reason. She had earned her place through hard work and dedication. Her music came from a different place than theirs, but that did not make it less valuable. She took a deep breath and prepared to face whatever came next. The morning continued with more performances. Sarah watched and learned. She studied how each student approached the piano. She noticed their posture and hand positions. She listened to how they interpreted the music. But most of all, she waited for her chance to show what music meant to her. His seat was in the perfect spot where everyone could see him and he could see everyone else. He wore a dark gray suit that his father had bought him from the most expensive store in the city. His shoes were black leather and polished until they shined like mirrors. His hair was perfectly styled, and he smelled like expensive cologne. Marcus had been coming to the conservatory since he was 5 years old. His grandfather had studied here. His father had graduated from here with honors. Now it was Marcus's turn to continue the family tradition. The Wellington name was carved into a stone plaque in the main entrance hall. They had donated enough money over the years to have their own practice room named after them. He looked around the hall with the confidence of someone who owned the place. In many ways, he did. His family's donations helped pay for new instruments and scholarships. Teachers knew his name before they met him. Other students respected him because of his family's reputation and his own musical skills. Marcus had won 3 piano competitions in the past year. He had performed with the City Symphony Orchestra twice. Music magazines had written articles about him. They called him a rising star in classical music. His parents had framed these articles and hung them in their mansion. But today, something bothered Marcus. He had noticed a girl in the back row who did not fit in. She wore a simple dress that looked cheap. Her bag was old and worn. She sat alone while other students chatted in groups. Marcus prided himself on knowing everyone important at the conservatory. He made it his business to know who had talent and who had connections. This girl was neither. During the break between performances, Marcus stood up and stretched. He walked toward the back of the hall, greeting other students as he passed. Everyone smiled when they saw him coming. Some tried to start conversations, hoping to impress him or gain his friendship. Marcus was polite but distant. He had more important things on his mind. He stopped near Sarah's row and pretended to look at the program. From the corner of his eye, he studied her more closely. Her sheet music was visible in her open bag. The pages looked old and yellowed. Some had tape holding torn corners together. Marcus owned hundreds of pieces of music, all printed on the finest paper and kept in perfect condition. A girl named Jennifer approached Marcus. Jennifer came from a wealthy family like his. Her parents owned a chain of music stores. She had been trying to get Marcus's attention for months. She saw him looking toward the back and followed his gaze. "Who is that girl?" Jennifer asked quietly. "I have never seen her before." Marcus shrugged. "No one important, I am sure. Probably here on some kind of charity program." Jennifer giggled. "She looks out of place. Did you see her dress? I think I saw the same one at a discount store last week." Marcus smiled but said nothing. He was forming an opinion about Sarah based on what he could see. In his world, appearance mattered. Success was measured by expensive clothes, perfect performances, and family connections. People who did not have these things simply did not matter. He moved closer to where Sarah sat. She was talking quietly to another scholarship student named David. David was a nice boy who played cello. He came from a middle-class family and worked hard to afford his lessons. Marcus tolerated David because he was talented, but he did not consider him a real friend. "I have been playing piano since I was very young," Sarah was saying to David. "But I never had formal lessons. I learned by listening and practicing on my own." Marcus's eyebrows went up. No formal lessons? At the Berkshire Conservatory? This was almost unheard of. Every student here had studied with master teachers. They had spent years learning proper technique and music theory. The idea that someone could succeed without this training seemed impossible to Marcus. "How did you get into the music therapy program?" David asked Sarah. "I work at a nursing home," Sarah explained. "I play piano for the residents there. The director saw how much it helped them and recommended me for the scholarship. I guess the conservatory wanted to try something different." Marcus had heard enough. He turned to Jennifer and whispered, "She is here on a charity scholarship. No real training. They are lowering the standards just to look good." Jennifer nodded in agreement. "It is not fair to the students who have worked hard and paid full tuition." Word spread quickly among Marcus's circle of friends. By the time the showcase resumed, half the students in the front rows knew about Sarah. They whispered among themselves and glanced back at her. Some looked curious. Others seemed annoyed that someone without proper training was allowed to participate. Marcus felt a growing sense of righteousness. The conservatory was a sacred place where only the most dedicated and talented musicians should study. Letting in people who had not earned their place through years of proper training was an insult to everyone who had worked hard to be there. During the next break, Marcus decided to take action. He walked directly to Sarah's row and sat down in the empty seat next to her. Sarah looked surprised to see such a well-dressed, confident student talking to her. "Hello," Marcus said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I am Marcus Wellington. I could not help but notice you sitting here, alone." Sarah felt nervous but tried to be polite. "Hello, I am Sarah Martinez. Nice to meet you." "Martinez," Marcus repeated. "Interesting name. Are you from around here?" "I live about 2 hours away," Sarah said. "I take the bus here for classes." Marcus nodded as if this confirmed what he already knew. "And you are studying music therapy?" "I heard?" "Yes," Sarah said, wondering why this important-looking student was talking to her. "I work with elderly people. Music helps them remember things and feel better." "How nice," Marcus said in a tone that suggested he thought it was anything but nice. "And you play piano?" "I do," Sarah said. "I love playing." "Wonderful," Marcus said. "Tell me, who was your teacher? Which conservatory did you attend before coming here?" Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She could sense this was some kind of test. "I did not have a formal teacher. I learned by practicing and listening." Marcus's smile grew wider but colder. "How fascinating. No teacher at all?" "My grandmother showed me some basic things when I was little," Sarah said. "But mostly I taught myself." Marcus leaned back in his seat. "Self-taught. How remarkable." His voice carried a note of disbelief mixed with amusement. Other students nearby had stopped their conversations to listen. Sarah felt like she was under a microscope. She did not understand why this student was asking her so many questions, but she sensed it was not friendly curiosity. "Music is quite complex," Marcus continued. "There are so many technical aspects: proper hand position, musical theory, interpretation of classical pieces. It takes years of study with qualified teachers to master these things." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. "I may not know all the technical terms," she said quietly, "but I understand music. I know how it makes people feel." Marcus chuckled, softly. "Feeling is nice, of course. But classical music requires much more than just feeling. It requires precision, technique, and deep understanding of musical tradition." The students around them had formed a small circle. Some looked uncomfortable with Marcus's questioning. Others seemed to enjoy watching Sarah squirm. Sarah realized she was being tested and probably failing in their eyes. I am sure you mean well, Marcus said, standing up. But the Berkshire Conservatory has very high standards. We cannot lower those standards for everyone. With that, he walked away, leaving Sarah sitting alone with burning cheeks and a heavy heart. She knew she had just been dismissed by someone who considered himself far above her. The worst part was that maybe he was right. The intermission had lasted longer than planned. Students filled the hallways outside the main performance hall. They gathered in small groups, talking about the performances they had just heard. Some compared notes about techniques they had observed. Others discussed which students had impressed them the most. Sarah stood by herself near a large window that looked out onto the conservatory gardens. She held a cup of water from the drinking fountain and tried to calm her nerves. The conversation with Marcus had shaken her confidence. She kept replaying his words in her mind. Maybe she really did not belong here. Maybe she was fooling herself into thinking she could compete with students who had trained their entire lives. Marcus stood across the hallway surrounded by his usual group of admirers. Jennifer was there, along with two other wealthy students, named Robert and Alexandra. They spoke in low voices but occasionally glanced toward Sarah. Their expressions made it clear they were talking about her. "It is really quite unfair," Jennifer was saying. "Students like us have spent thousands of dollars on lessons and years practicing. Then they let someone in who has never even had a real teacher." Robert nodded in agreement. "My father says the conservatory is becoming too political. They care more about looking diverse than maintaining quality." Alexandra looked toward Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "She seems nice enough, but this is the Berkshire Conservatory. Nice is not enough. You need real talent and proper training." Marcus listened to his friends but said little. He was forming a plan in his mind. Someone needed to show this girl that she was out of her league. It would be better for everyone if she realized her mistake now, rather than embarrassing herself later. A few other students had noticed the tension. David, the cello player who had been talking to Sarah earlier, felt uncomfortable about what was happening. He could see that Sarah was being isolated and judged. But David was not confident enough to stand up to Marcus's group. They had power and influence that he could not match. An older student named Michael also watched the situation develop. Michael was in his final year at the conservatory. He came from a working-class family and had earned his way through scholarships and part-time jobs. He recognized something of himself in Sarah's situation, but Michael had learned to keep his head down and avoid conflicts with influential students like Marcus. As the intermission continued, more students became aware of the drama unfolding. Word spread that there was a scholarship student who claimed to be self-taught. Some students were curious to see what she could do. Others whispered that it was insulting to their own hard work and sacrifices. Marcus decided it was time to take action. He walked across the hallway toward Sarah with his group following behind him. Other students sensed something was about to happen and gathered around to watch. Sarah saw Marcus approaching and felt her stomach tighten. She could tell by his expression and the way other students were following him that this was not going to be a friendly conversation. "Sarah," Marcus said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I have been thinking about our conversation earlier." Sarah nodded but said nothing. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her. "I realize I may have seemed skeptical about your background," Marcus continued, "but I think it is fascinating that you learned piano entirely on your own." Sarah was confused by his tone. He sounded friendly, but something felt wrong. "Thank you," she said carefully. "Tell everyone how you learned to play," Marcus said with an encouraging smile. "I think they would find your story inspiring." Sarah looked around at all the faces staring at her. She felt trapped but tried to answer honestly. "I started when I was young. My grandmother had an old piano. She showed me a few basic things before she died. After that, I just practiced and listened to music." "No sheet music?" Marcus asked. "Some," Sarah said. "But mostly I played by ear. I listened to songs and figured out how to play them." Marcus nodded as if this was exactly what he expected to hear. "So you play by feeling rather than following proper musical notation?" "I can read music," Sarah said defensively. "But yes, I also play by feeling. I think music should touch people's hearts. Several students in Marcus's group exchanged glances. Playing by feeling instead of following precise notation was exactly the kind of amateur approach they looked down on. How interesting, Marcus said. And you mentioned you work at a nursing home. Yes, Sarah said, wondering where this was leading. I play for the residents there. Music therapy helps them with memory and mood. So you play simple songs for elderly people, Marcus said. That is very kind of you. The way he said simple, songs made it sound like something a child might do. Sarah felt her face getting hot. The songs may be simple, but the effect they have is not simple. I have seen music bring people back from depression. I have watched it help people remember their loved ones. Marcus smiled wider. Of course, but that is quite different from performing classical music, is it not? The standards are completely different. Music is music, Sarah said quietly. Whether it is classical or popular, it comes from the same place. This statement caused several students to gasp quietly. Comparing classical music to popular music was like comparing fine art to cartoon drawings in their world. Marcus had led Sarah into saying exactly what he wanted her to say. Ah, Marcus said, raising his eyebrows. So you think classical music and popular music are the same thing? Sarah realized she had walked into a trap. That is not what I meant. I meant that all music has the power to move people. But surely you understand that classical music requires years of technical training, Marcus said. The great composers like Bach and Beethoven created works of incredible complexity. You cannot just play them by feeling. I never said you could, Sarah replied, but her voice was getting smaller. Marcus turned to address the crowd that had gathered. This is exactly what I was talking about earlier. The conservatory is supposed to train serious musicians, people who understand the complexity and tradition of classical music, not people who think they can just play by feeling. Several students nodded in agreement. Sarah felt like she was drowning. She had not meant to insult classical music or suggest it was easy. But Marcus had twisted her words to make her sound foolish and disrespectful. Piano is not just about making people feel good, Marcus continued, his voice getting stronger. It is about precision, technique, and respect for musical tradition. These are things you learn from master teachers, not from playing simple songs. For elderly people. The crowd around them had grown larger. Sarah could see some students looking uncomfortable with Marcus's attack, but no one spoke up to defend her. She was completely alone. I respect classical music, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I never meant to suggest it was easy. Marcus shrugged. Perhaps not. But respect is not enough. Understanding is what matters. And understanding comes from proper training, not from playing by ear at a nursing home. Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She had come, here with hope and excitement. She had believed that her love of music and her ability to touch people's hearts mattered, but Marcus was making her feel like none of that counted for anything. The truth is, Marcus said, looking directly at Sarah, some people belong at the Berkshire Conservatory and some people do not. It is not personal, it is just reality. With that final statement, Marcus turned and walked away with his group following behind him. The crowd of students slowly dispersed, many of them whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Sarah stood alone by the window, fighting back tears and wondering if she should just leave right now. The students slowly made their way back into the performance hall. The intermission was ending and the second half of the showcase was about to begin. Sarah walked behind everyone else, her head down, and her confidence shattered. She considered leaving through the side exit and catching the next bus home. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe she did not belong here. But something inside her refused to give up completely. She had worked too hard to get here. Her parents had sacrificed too much for her to quit now. She found her seat in the back row and sat down heavily. Her bag felt heavier than before, weighed down by doubt and embarrassment. The director of the conservatory returned to the stage. She was a tall woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a black dress and had the kind of presence that commanded attention from everyone in the room. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, We will now continue with our scheduled performances. However, I have decided to add something special to today's program. The students looked at each other with curiosity. Unscheduled changes were rare at the conservatory. Everything was usually planned months in advance. As you know, the director continued, the Berkshire Conservatory values both excellence and opportunity. We believe that music has the power to surprise us when we least expect it. Therefore, I am announcing an impromptu open performance segment. A murmur ran through the audience. An open performance meant that any student could volunteer to play, without having prepared or signed up in advance. This was unusual and exciting. Any student who wishes to perform may come forward, the director said. This is an opportunity to share your passion for music in an informal setting. Who knows? You might discover something about yourself or surprise the rest of us. Several students raised their hands immediately. The chance to perform an extra time was valuable. It meant more exposure and another opportunity to impress teachers and fellow students. Marcus saw an opportunity. He had been looking for a way to further expose Sarah's lack of proper training. An impromptu performance would be perfect. She would have to play without preparation, and her weaknesses would be obvious to everyone. He stood up from his seat and called out loudly, "I think our new student Sarah should play something for us." Every head in the hall turned to look at Sarah. She felt her face burn with embarrassment and panic. Marcus was putting her on the spot in front of hundreds of people. "Yes," Jennifer chimed in from her seat. "Sarah was just telling us about her interesting approach to piano. I think everyone would love to hear her play." Other students began to nod and murmur in agreement. Some were genuinely curious to hear what this mysterious scholarship student could do. Others were eager to see her fail publicly. The director looked toward the back of the hall where Sarah sat frozen in her chair. "Sarah Martinez?" she asked. "Would you like to perform for us?" Sarah felt like she could not breathe. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. This was exactly what she had feared would happen. She was being forced to prove herself in front of people who already doubted her abilities. "Come on, Sarah," Marcus called out with false encouragement. "Do not be shy. Everyone would love to hear your unique style." The way he said unique style made it sound like a joke. Sarah knew he was setting her up to fail. But now that he had called her out publicly, she could not refuse without looking like a coward. David, the cello player, turned around in his seat and gave Sarah an encouraging nod. He was one of the few students who seemed to genuinely support her, but even his kind gesture could not calm her nerves. "Sarah?" the director asked again. "The choice is yours, of course." Sarah looked around the hall at all the faces staring at her. Some looked curious, others looked skeptical. A few seemed sympathetic, but most appeared to be waiting for entertainment, whether good or bad. She thought about her grandmother, who had first shown her how to place her fingers on piano keys. She thought about Mrs. Chen at the nursing home, who smiled whenever Sarah played her favorite song. She thought about her parents, who believed in her even when she did not believe in herself. Slowly, Sarah stood up. Her legs felt weak and her hands were trembling, but she forced herself to walk toward the stage. The hall fell silent except for the sound of her footsteps on the carpet. Marcus smiled to himself. His plan was working perfectly. Sarah was about to embarrass herself in front of everyone. After this, no one would question his judgment about who belonged at the conservatory and who did not. "Wonderful," the director said as Sarah approached the stage. "What would you like to play for us today?" Sarah climbed the steps to the stage on unsteady legs. The grand piano looked even more magnificent up close. Its black surface was so polished she could see her reflection in it. The keys were perfectly white and clean, not worn down like the keys on the old piano at the nursing home. She sat down on the bench and adjusted her position. The seat was the perfect height and the pedals were exactly where they should be. This piano was a masterpiece, far better than any instrument she had ever played. The hall was completely quiet. Hundreds of people waited to hear what she would do. Sarah could feel their expectations pressing down on her like a heavy weight. Some wanted her to succeed, others wanted her to fail, but all of them were watching and judging. Marcus leaned forward in his seat, ready to enjoy the disaster he had orchestrated. He had put Sarah in an impossible position. She would have to play something challenging enough to impress a conservatory audience, but she lacked the technical training to pull it off. Her failure would prove his point about maintaining standards. Sarah placed her hands above the keys but did not touch them yet. She closed her eyes and tried to block out the audience. She thought about why she loved music in the first place. It was not about impressing people or proving she was better than others. It was about connection, emotion, and healing. She opened her eyes and looked out at the sea of faces watching her. Then she made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of launching into a complex classical piece to try to impress them, Sarah decided to be completely honest about who she was and what music meant to her. She would play from her heart, not from a desire to fit in or meet their expectations. She took a deep breath and prepared to show them what music could really do when it came from a place of love rather than a need to prove something. The hall waited in complete silence for her first note. Marcus sat back in his chair with a satisfied smile. In a few minutes, everyone would see that he had been right about Sarah all along. The impromptu performance would be over quickly, and Sarah would probably leave the conservatory in tears. But Marcus had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated the power of authentic emotion and the strength that comes from knowing exactly why you love something. Sarah sat at the grand piano with her hands hovering above the keys. The silence in the hall was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat. Hundreds of eyes watched her every movement. Some faces showed curiosity, others skepticism, and a few displayed barely hidden amusement as they waited for her to embarrass herself. Her fingers trembled slightly as she looked down at the pristine white and black keys. This piano was worth more money than her family made in a year. The keys were perfectly balanced and responsive. Even the slightest touch would produce a beautiful sound. It was both intimidating and inspiring at the same time. Marcus leaned back, in his seat with his arms crossed, wearing a confident smile. He whispered something to Jennifer, who giggled quietly. They were both certain that Sarah was about to prove their point about maintaining proper standards at the conservatory. In their minds, this impromptu performance would end her brief and misguided attempt to belong in their world. Sarah closed her eyes again and tried to calm her racing heart. She thought about all the reasons she had come to doubt herself in the past hour. Marcus had made her feel small and unworthy. His friends had looked at her like she was an intruder in their sacred space. Even some of the other students seemed to question whether she belonged here. But then she remembered something her grandmother had told her years ago. Music is not about showing off, her grandmother had said. Music is about sharing what is in your heart. When you play with love, people will feel that love. Sarah opened her eyes and looked out at the audience. Instead of seeing judges waiting to criticize her, she tried to see them as people who loved music just as much as she did. They were here because they cared about music. They had dedicated their lives to learning and performing. Maybe they would understand if she showed them what music meant to her. She placed her right index finger on middle C and pressed down gently. The note rang out clear and pure in the perfect acoustics of the hall. It was just one note, but it filled the entire space with sound. The note hung in the air for several seconds before slowly fading away. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had expected Sarah to launch into a complex piece immediately. Playing a single note seemed strange and amateurish to them. Marcus's smile grew wider. This was even worse than he had hoped. She was going to play something so simple that everyone would see how out of her depth she was. But Sarah was not finished. As the first note faded, she pressed the same key again, this time with slightly more pressure. The note sang out again, but with more intensity and warmth. She let it ring until it died away naturally. The hall remained silent. Even the students who were ready to laugh held their breath. There was something about the way Sarah played that single note that demanded attention. It was not just a sound. It was a statement. Sarah pressed middle C a third time, but now she began to add other notes around it. Her left hand found the bass notes that would support the melody she was beginning to create. She was not following any sheet music. She was building something from her heart and her memory. The notes she chose began to form a pattern that some people in the audience recognized. It was the opening of Clair de Lune by Claude Debussy, one of the most beautiful and challenging pieces in the classical piano repertoire. But Sarah was not playing it exactly as it was written in any music book. Marcus's confident smile began to fade. Clair de Lune was not a simple song. It required technical skill and emotional depth to perform well. Many students at the conservatory struggled with this piece even after months of practice with qualified teachers. Sarah's interpretation began slowly and gently, just like the original composition intended. But there was something different about the way she played it. Each note seemed to carry weight and meaning beyond the technical requirements. Her fingers moved across the keys with a natural grace that could not be taught in any classroom. The melody flowed from her hands like water, finding its way down a hillside. She was not just playing the notes that Debussy had written, she was telling a story with those notes. Each phrase carried emotion that came from deep inside her soul. As the piece continued, Sarah's confidence grew. Her hands moved more freely across the keyboard. She added subtle variations to the dynamics, making some notes whisper and others sing out boldly. Her interpretation was both faithful to the original composition and uniquely her own. The students in the audience began to lean forward in their seats. Even those who had expected her to fail were drawn in by the beauty of her performance. This was not the amateur playing they had anticipated. This was music being performed by someone who understood it on a level that went beyond technical training. David, the friendly cello player, felt goosebumps on his arms as he listened. He had heard Clair de Lune performed many times by skilled pianists, but never quite like this. Sarah was playing with a depth of feeling that touched something in his heart. Even some of the faculty members who had been grading papers in the back of the hall stopped what they were doing to listen. They exchanged surprised glances as they recognized the quality of the performance they were hearing. Marcus sat frozen in his seat. This was not what was supposed to happen. Sarah was not supposed to be able to play like this. She was supposed to struggle and fumble, proving that proper training was necessary for success at the conservatory, but instead, she was creating something beautiful and moving. Jennifer's smug expression had completely disappeared. She found herself caught up in the music, despite her earlier criticism of Sarah. The melody seemed to wrap around her heart and squeeze gently, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. Sarah was completely absorbed in the music now. She had forgotten about the audience and their expectations. She was playing for Mrs. Chen, who loved gentle melodies that reminded her of her youth. She was playing for Mr. Johnson, who cried when music brought back memories of his deceased wife. She was playing for her grandmother, who had first shown her the magic that could come from touching piano keys with love. The piece moved through its various sections with Sarah guiding it like a conductor leading an orchestra. She knew exactly when to make the music louder and when to let it whisper. She knew which notes to emphasize and which ones to let flow by like gentle breezes. As Clair de Lune approached its conclusion, the entire hall was mesmerized. Even the most skeptical students had stopped whispering and were listening with complete attention. Sarah had transformed the performance space into something sacred where music could touch souls directly. The final notes of the piece hung in the air, like stars in a clear night sky. Sarah's hands remained poised above the keys for a moment before she slowly lowered them to her lap. She sat perfectly still, letting the last echoes of the music fade away naturally. The hall remained silent for several heartbeats after the music ended. No one moved or spoke. They were all processing what they had just experienced. As the last note of Clair de Lune faded into silence, something magical happened in the conservatory hall. The music had created a spell that held everyone captive. Sarah sat at the piano with her hands in her lap, breathing quietly. She had played the piece exactly as she felt it should be played, with every emotion flowing directly from her heart through her fingers to the keys. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Students who had been ready to mock her sat with their mouths slightly open. Even Marcus, who had orchestrated this moment to humiliate Sarah, found himself unable to speak. The music had been far beyond anything he had expected from someone without formal training. But Sarah's performance was more than just technically correct playing. She had interpreted Debussy's masterpiece in a way that revealed depths of emotion many trained musicians never reached. Her version had not followed the exact dynamics and tempo markings that professors taught from textbooks. Instead, she had found the soul of the music and let it speak through her. Each phrase had told part of a story. When Sarah played the gentle, opening melody, listeners could almost see moonlight dancing on water. When the music swelled in the middle section, they felt the pull of deep emotions they could not name. When the piece returned to its quiet beginning, they experienced a peace that seemed to wash over their hearts. Professor Williams, the head of the piano department, sat in the faculty section with tears in his eyes. He had been teaching at the conservatory for 30 years. He had heard thousands of students perform this piece. Many had played it with perfect technique and flawless timing. But none had made him feel what Sarah just made him feel. The transformation was not just in how people heard the music, it was in how they saw Sarah herself. Moments before, she had been dismissed as an unqualified scholarship student who did not belong at their prestigious institution. Now she sat before them as someone who possessed a rare gift that could not be taught in any classroom. Jennifer, who had laughed at Sarah's simple dress and old sheet music, found herself wiping away tears she did not understand. The music had reached something deep inside her that she had forgotten existed. All her expensive lessons and competition victories suddenly seemed less important than what she had just witnessed. Robert, another student in Marcus's circle, stared at Sarah with newfound respect. He had spent years learning to play with technical precision, but his performances never moved people the way Sarah's just had. He began to question whether all his advantages and training had actually limited his ability to connect with music on an emotional level. Alexandra, who had criticized Sarah's background just an hour earlier, felt ashamed of her earlier comments. The music had revealed a truth that was uncomfortable to face. Technical training and expensive education did not automatically create great musicians. Sometimes the most powerful music came from places that could not be measured or evaluated by traditional standards. David, who had been kind to Sarah from the beginning, felt vindicated in his belief that she was special. But even he was surprised by the depth of her talent. He had known she could play, but he had not realized she could create art that touched souls so directly. Sarah remained seated at the piano, unaware of the profound effect she had just had on her audience. She was thinking about her grandmother's hands showing her how to find middle C on their old piano. She was remembering the joy on Mrs. Chen's face when music helped her remember happy times. She was feeling grateful for every moment that had led her to this beautiful instrument in this magnificent hall. The silence continued for several more seconds. Then from somewhere in the middle of the hall, someone began to clap. The applause started slowly and softly, but it grew quickly as more people joined in. Soon the entire hall was filled with the sound of hands coming together in appreciation. But this was not the polite, measured applause that usually followed conservatory performances. This was something more spontaneous and heartfelt. Students were clapping harder and longer than they typically did. Some were standing up from their seats. Others were calling out words of appreciation. Professor Martinez, who taught music therapy and had recommended Sarah for her scholarship, stood up and applauded with obvious pride. She had known Sarah had talent, but even she had not expected this level of artistry. The young woman had justified every bit of faith that had been placed in her. The conservatory director, who had announced the impromptu performance opportunity, watched the audience response with satisfaction. She had spent her career learning to recognize genuine musical talent, and she knew she had just witnessed something special. Sarah's performance reminded her why she had devoted her life to music education. Even some of the maintenance staff, who had been working in the back of the hall, stopped what they were doing to listen and applaud. Music at this level transcended social and educational boundaries. It spoke to anyone who had ears to hear and a heart to feel. Marcus remained seated while everyone around him stood and clapped. His face showed a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of shame. His carefully constructed worldview was crumbling around him. Everything he had believed about talent, training, and worthiness was being challenged by what he had just heard. He had been so certain that Sarah would embarrass herself. He had been so confident that her lack of formal training would be exposed as a fatal flaw. Instead, she had played with more emotional depth and musical understanding than most students achieved after years of expensive lessons. Jennifer noticed that Marcus was not applauding and leaned over to whisper to him. "She is actually quite good, is she not?" Marcus could not answer. Good was not the right word for what they had just heard. Sarah had not just played well. She had created something transcendent. She had taken a piece of music that he knew intimately and shown him layers of meaning he had never discovered in his own technically perfect performances. The applause continued for almost a full minute before it began to fade. Sarah finally stood up from the piano bench and turned to face the audience. Her cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright with emotion. She had not expected this kind of response, but she could feel the warmth and appreciation flowing toward her from the crowd. She gave a small bow, the way she had seen other students do after their performances. Then she walked across the stage toward the steps that would take her back to her seat. But as she walked, she noticed that people's faces looked different than they had before. The skepticism and dismissal she had seen earlier were gone. In their place was respect, admiration, and something that looked like wonder. Professor Williams stood up from his seat in the faculty section and called out, "Miss Martinez, would you please stay on stage for a moment?" Sarah stopped walking and turned back toward the piano. She felt nervous again, wondering if she had done something wrong. Had her interpretation been too different from the traditional way of playing the piece? The professor walked up onto the stage and stood beside Sarah. He turned to address the audience with a smile on his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we have just witnessed what happens when technical skill combines with genuine musical soul. Miss Martinez has reminded us all why we fell in love with music in the first place." Professor Williams stood beside Sarah on the stage, his experienced eyes scanning the faces in the audience. He had been teaching piano for 3 decades and had learned to recognize those rare moments when music transcended mere performance and became something sacred. What Sarah had just accomplished was exactly that kind of moment. "In all my years at this conservatory," he continued, addressing the silent hall, "I have heard hundreds of students perform this piece. Many have played it with flawless technique. Others have memorized every dynamic marking and tempo indication. But very few have understood what Debussy was really trying to express when he composed Clair de Lune." Sarah stood beside him, still, not fully understanding the impact of what she had just done. She had simply played the piece the way it felt right to her. She had not tried to impress anyone or prove anything. She had just shared her love of the music. "Miss Martinez has shown us something important today," Professor Williams said. "She has reminded us that music is not just about following rules or demonstrating technical skills. Music is about communication. It is about touching the human heart. It is about making people feel something they cannot put into words." Marcus sat frozen in his seat, his worldview crumbling around him. Everything he had been taught about music suddenly seemed incomplete. He had spent years perfecting his technique, memorizing pieces note for note, and performing them exactly as his teachers instructed. His performances were always technically perfect, but he was beginning to realize they might be missing something essential. He thought about his last performance of Clair de Lune. He had played every note correctly and received polite applause from the audience, but no one had been moved to tears. No one had stood up spontaneously. No one had felt their heart touched the way people clearly felt after hearing Sarah play. The revelation was uncomfortable and humbling. Marcus had always believed that his expensive education and family connections made him superior to students like Sarah. But her performance had revealed a truth he did not want to face. Privilege and training were not enough to create great music. Something deeper was required, something that could not be bought or taught. Jennifer also felt shaken by what she had witnessed. She had grown up surrounded by music, attending concerts and taking lessons from famous teachers. She could discuss musical theory and identify complex harmonies. But when Sarah played, Jennifer had felt something she rarely experienced during performances. The music had reached into her chest and squeezed her heart. She began to question whether all her technical knowledge had actually distanced her from the emotional power of music. Had she become so focused on playing correctly that she had forgotten how to play meaningfully? David, the cello player who had been kind to Sarah from the beginning, felt a mixture of joy and humility. He was happy to see Sarah succeed so dramatically, but he was also confronted with his own limitations as a musician. He had always thought of himself as someone who played with feeling, but Sarah's performance made him realize how much deeper he could go. The other scholarship students in the audience felt a surge of hope and validation. Many of them came from backgrounds similar to Sarah's. They had worried that their lack of expensive training would hold them back forever. But Sarah's triumph showed them that different kinds of preparation could lead to equally powerful results. Professor Martinez, who taught music therapy, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her former student receive recognition. She had always known that Sarah possessed special abilities, but even she had not expected this level of artistry. Sarah's work at the nursing home had developed her ability to connect with people through music in ways that traditional training could not replicate. The conservatory director stood up from her seat and joined Professor Williams and Sarah on the stage. She was a woman who valued both tradition and innovation, and she recognized that Sarah represented something important for the future of the institution. What we have just heard, the director said to the audience, represents exactly what the Berkshire Conservatory should be about. Yes, we value technical excellence and musical scholarship, but we also value the kind of deep understanding that allows music to fulfill its highest purpose. She turned to look at Sarah with genuine admiration. Miss Martinez, your performance has reminded us that there are many paths to musical excellence. Your background in music therapy has given you insights that complement your natural talent in remarkable ways. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the praise and attention. She had come to the conservatory feeling like an outsider, but now she was being celebrated as an example of what the school stood for. It was almost too much to process. I want to invite you to consider expanding your studies here, the director continued. We would be honored to offer you additional opportunities to develop your gifts while sharing your unique perspective with other students. The audience erupted in another round of applause. Students who had dismissed Sarah an hour earlier were now clapping enthusiastically for her success. The transformation in the room was complete and undeniable, but the most dramatic change was happening in Marcus himself. As he watched Sarah receive praise and recognition, he felt something he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he doubted his own abilities and questioned his assumptions about what made someone worthy of respect. He thought about all the times he had looked down on students who came from different backgrounds. He remembered the dismissive comments he had made about charity cases and lowering standards. Now he realized that he had been the one with limited understanding. Sarah's performance had revealed the poverty of his own musical soul. Despite all his training and advantages, he had never moved an audience the way she just had. He had never created the kind of connection between performer and listener that transforms a concert into a shared emotional experience. The revelation was painful, but necessary. Marcus was beginning to understand that true musical excellence required more than technical skill and proper training. It required the courage to be vulnerable, the wisdom to understand human emotion, and the humility to serve something greater than oneself. As the applause finally died down and students began to file out of the hall, Marcus remained in his seat. He watched Sarah shake hands with professors and accept congratulations from fellow students. The girl he had tried to humiliate was now surrounded by admirers and mentors eager to support her development. For the first time in his privileged life, Marcus felt genuinely ashamed of his behavior. He had revealed his own character flaws while trying to expose what he thought were Sarah's weaknesses. The irony was not lost on him. Jennifer approached his seat cautiously. Marcus, are you all right? You look pale. Marcus looked up at his friend with eyes that showed genuine confusion and regret. I think I need to apologize to someone, he said quietly. Jennifer understood immediately what he meant. She had also been humbled by Sarah's performance and was questioning her own earlier judgments. Yes, she agreed. I think we both do. The conservatory hall slowly emptied as students and faculty members made their way toward the exits. Many stopped to speak with Sarah, offering congratulations and expressing their admiration for her performance. She found herself surrounded by people who wanted to know more about her background and her approach to music. Professor Williams remained on stage with Sarah, discussing possibilities for her future studies. The music therapy program was excellent, but he believed she had the potential to pursue additional training in classical performance if she was interested. Other faculty members joined the conversation, each offering their perspectives on how the conservatory could best support her development. Sarah listened to their suggestions with growing excitement and gratitude. Just hours earlier, she had felt like an imposter who did not belong at this prestigious institution. Now, professors were discussing advanced opportunities and talking about her as if she were a valued member of their community. Meanwhile, Marcus sat alone in his row, watching the celebration happening on stage. The contrast between Sarah's triumph and his own shame was stark and uncomfortable. He had orchestrated what he thought would be her humiliation, but instead had witnessed his own moral failure played out in front of hundreds of people. Jennifer and Robert had gone to speak with other students, leaving Marcus to confront his thoughts alone. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, seeing them now from a completely different perspective. His comments about charity cases and lowering standards seemed cruel and ignorant in light of what Sarah had accomplished. He thought about his own relationship with music. Yes, he was technically skilled and had won competitions. But when was the last time his playing had moved someone to tears? When had he ever created the kind of profound connection with an audience that Sarah had just achieved? The painful truth was that his music had become mechanical and soulless. He played notes correctly, but had forgotten how to make them sing with meaning. He impressed judges with his precision, but failed to touch hearts with his emotions. As Sarah finished her conversations with the faculty and began to gather her things, Marcus made a decision. He stood up from his seat and walked down the aisle toward the stage. His steps felt heavy, weighted down by regret and the difficulty of what he was about to do. Sarah noticed him approaching and felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. After everything that had happened, she was not sure she wanted another confrontation with Marcus, but something in his expression was different. The arrogance and smugness were gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "Sarah," Marcus said quietly when he reached the edge of the stage, "could I speak with you for a moment?" Sarah looked at the professors who were still nearby, then back at Marcus. She nodded slowly and stepped down from the stage to meet him. At floor level, "I owe you an apology," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Actually, I owe you much more than that, but an apology is where I need to start." Sarah was surprised by his tone. This was not the confident, dismissive person who had challenged her earlier. This Marcus looked vulnerable and uncertain. "I was wrong about you," he continued. "I was wrong about what makes someone qualified to be here. I was wrong about what music is supposed to be about. I was just wrong about everything." Sarah did not know how to respond. She had expected many things from this day, but a heartfelt apology from Marcus Wellington III was not one of them. "Your performance tonight showed me something I had forgotten," Marcus said. "Music is not about proving you are better than other people. It is not about showing off your training or your family connections. It is about sharing something beautiful with the world." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I have been playing piano for most of my life, but I realize now that I have never really understood what music is for. You showed me in 15 minutes what I should have learned in 15 years. Sarah felt her anger toward Marcus beginning to soften. She could see that his apology was genuine and that her performance had affected him deeply. "Thank you for saying that," she said quietly. "It means a lot." "I want to ask you something," Marcus continued. "Would you be willing to teach me?" Sarah looked at him with confusion. "Teach you what? You already know how to play piano much better than I do." Marcus shook his head. "I know how to play notes correctly, but you know how to play music meaningfully. That is something I apparently never learned, despite all my expensive lessons. The request was so unexpected that Sarah did not know how to answer. The idea of teaching Marcus Wellington III anything about music seemed impossible, but she could see that he was serious and that his humility was real. "I do not know if I could teach you that," Sarah said honestly. "For me, it just comes from caring about the people who are listening. I think about how the music makes them feel, not about whether I am playing it perfectly." "That is exactly what I need to learn," Marcus said. "I have spent so much time trying to impress people that I forgot about connecting with them." Professor Williams, who had been listening to their conversation from a respectful distance, approached them with a smile. "Mr. Wellington, I believe you have just learned something more valuable than anything we could teach you in a classroom." Marcus looked up at the professor with surprise. He had not realized anyone was listening to his conversation with Sarah. "The ability to recognize your own limitations and ask for help from someone you previously dismissed," Professor Williams continued. "That shows real maturity and wisdom. It also shows that you might finally be ready to become a true musician, instead of just a skilled performer." The professor turned to Sarah. "And Miss Martinez, I think you have already begun teaching just by being yourself. Your performance today will influence every student who heard it. You have shown them what authentic musical expression looks like." Over the following weeks, word of Sarah's performance spread throughout the conservatory and beyond. Students who had not been present that day asked to hear recordings. Faculty members discussed her interpretation in their classes as an example of music's emotional power. Marcus began studying with renewed purpose, but his focus had shifted completely. Instead of trying to play faster or more accurately than other students, he worked on understanding the emotional content of each piece he learned. He spent time listening to Sarah play at the nursing home, observing how she connected with her audience. The relationship between Marcus and Sarah evolved from hostility to mutual respect, and eventually, to genuine friendship. Marcus learned humility, while Sarah gained confidence in her abilities and her place at the conservatory. Jennifer, Robert, and Alexandra also experienced changes in their attitudes and approaches to music. Sarah's example helped them remember why they had fallen in love with music in the first place, before competition and social pressure had complicated their motivations. David continued to be Sarah's friend and supporter, but now he was part of a much larger group of students who appreciated her unique gifts and perspective. The conservatory itself benefited from the lessons learned that day. Faculty members began placing greater emphasis on emotional expression alongside technical development. They invited more students from diverse backgrounds, recognizing that different life experiences could enrich the musical community. Sarah completed her music therapy degree with honors and was offered a position on the faculty immediately upon graduation. Her work bridged the gap between classical training and practical application, showing students how music could heal and transform lives. Years later, when people talked about the most memorable moments in the conservatory's history, they often mentioned the day when a quiet scholarship student reminded everyone what music was really about. Sarah's single note that silenced the hall had grown into a symphony of change that affected countless lives. Marcus eventually became a successful performer, but his playing was transformed by what he learned from Sarah. Critics noted the emotional depth and authenticity of his interpretations. He never forgot the lesson that true musical excellence comes not from privilege or training alone, but from the courage to share one's heart with the world. The story of Sarah and Marcus became a legend at the conservatory, passed down from student to student as a reminder that talent can come from unexpected places and that the most important musical lessons often happen outside the classroom. It was a story about the power of authenticity, the importance of humility, and the magic that happens when music comes from the soul rather than just the fingers.